There's a silent, almost imperceptible moment when a good man begins to become emotionally vulnerable in the hands of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing. It's not a dramatic instant, not a sudden fall. It's a slow, gentle slide that feels like affection, like connection, but which, in fact, is the beginning of something deeper. Something that only reveals itself when he is already completely involved. And it all starts with a detail that many men ignore. Women notice long before men when they start to feel something real. This happens because they have an extremely precise emotional radar. They notice the change in the look, the slight extra sparkle, the way you respond faster, how you try to be more present, how your emotional posture opens up. For man, this may seem natural. For her, it is a clear sign. And it is at this exact moment that some women, not all, but the right ones, trigger a game that good men rarely recognize in time. The game of emotional influence. Not influence in the manipulative sense, but in the strategic sense. She realizes you're investing emotionally even before you admit it to yourself. So she starts testing access levels, measuring how much you're willing to do, tolerate, and justify. Not out of malice, but by nature. Psychology calls this an emotional power balance, the moment when the person who feels less realizes they have more control. And that's where the good man is at risk. Because he doesn't play games. He doesn't calculate. He feels. He gives. He dives in head first, believing that reciprocity is automatic, when in fact, reciprocity is built. He transforms himself, without realizing it, into someone easily molded by her reaction or lack thereof. And when she realizes this, it's the beginning of the invisible trap. Before continuing, remember, understanding this isn't about distrusting women. It's about understanding yourself and protecting the emotional value you carry. Because when you don't understand your worth, someone else will realize it before you do and will use it to lead you exactly where they want you to go. If you want to understand each psychological mechanism that transforms good men into emotional prey and, above all, how to avoid this, subscribe to the channel now. This video is just the beginning of a journey that will open your mind in a way that no one has ever explained to you. Good men always believe that their goodness is protection, that being loyal, kind, honest, and emotionally stable makes them someone safe, someone difficult to manipulate, someone who wouldn't be easily led by emotional games. But, in fact, it is precisely this set of virtues that makes them more vulnerable, especially in the hands of an emotionally strategic woman. Vulnerability stems from an internal confusion. The good man believes that others see the world as he sees it. He believes that if he is genuine, the other person will be too. If he doesn't play with feelings, the other person won't either. If he is transparent, she will be too. It's a naive, emotional mirroring. And however noble it may be, it's exactly what opens the door to vulnerability. An emotionally intelligent woman notices this very quickly. She notices the kind of look a good man has, a look that seeks reciprocity and building something together. And for some women, this awakens a very specific instinct to test the limits of this man, not out of malice, but out of psychological curiosity. She wants to know how far this man is capable of going, how long he remains available, how long he remains patient. And the more available he is, the more she tests him. The more understanding, the more she demands. The more resilient, the more she experiments. Not because she wants to destroy him, but because it reveals something very deep about him. How much he values himself. Good men who lack clarity of self-worth become emotionally malleable. They begin to accept emotional crumbs, believing that patience is love. They begin to justify absences, believing that understanding is a demonstration of maturity. They begin to accept emotional reversals as if they were normal challenges. But there is a great psychological truth here. When you accept little, you teach the other person to offer even less. And that is the most dangerous point. Because a woman who realizes this, the right woman, in a strategic sense, begins to guide the emotional dynamic. She creates alternations of closeness and distance, validations and absences, warmth and coldness. All this to understand how much he depends on her reaction to feel secure. When the good man realizes he is emotionally trapped, it is already too late. He is no longer guiding his own emotions. He is reacting to hers. He is no longer building the relationship. He is trying not to lose her. And this change in posture, although silent, is profound. It's the beginning of emotional dependency that transforms a good man into easy prey. And the following chapter explains exactly how this silent process takes hold without him realizing it. Emotional dependency doesn't arise from a sudden blow. It arises from pattern. And this pattern begins when the good man, the one who gives, supports, understands, invests, and surrenders, begins to realize that her reactions have become the emotional center of the relationship. None of this happens all at once. It's a gradual, almost imperceptible transition that transforms the dynamic without him realizing that something is being built around him. First, she creates small emotional variations. One day, she responds enthusiastically. The next, she responds coldly. One week, she seems interested. The next, she's distant. Sometimes she validates intensely. Other times, she ignores him completely. Each oscillation plants a doubt. Each doubt creates an imbalance. And each imbalance generates more emotional investment on his part. The central point is simple. The man begins to seek stability in her and no longer in himself. This is the most dangerous stage because the need for emotional stability is the root of dependency. The good man, accustomed to being rational, generous, and firm, begins to worry excessively about the impact of his own actions. He wants to avoid conflict. He wants to maintain the connection. He wants to ensure it continues. And that's exactly where a powerful psychological mechanism takes hold. Intermittent conditioning. Intermittent conditioning is the same mechanism used in gambling. The brain becomes addicted to unpredictable rewards because uncertainty intensely releases dopamine. The mind doesn't just seek pleasure, it seeks the anticipation of pleasure. And this creates an emotional bond that isn't logical, it's chemical. With her, it works like this. One day, he receives unexpected affection. The next, he receives unexplained coldness. Then a message that rekindles his hope. Then, silence that leaves him restless. In this alternation, he doesn't want to miss the affectionate good morning, nor the smile that appears after a difficult week, nor the moment when she becomes sweet again. He starts playing emotional games to recapture those moments without realizing that the mere act of trying already means he's trapped. His heart begins to crave that version of her that emerges from time to time. And this creates a bond even stronger than love, emotional addiction. The good man, wanting to avoid losses, begins to accept behaviors he would never have accepted before. He lowers his standards. He increases his tolerance. He reorganizes his emotional life around small crumbs of affection that keep him trapped in hope. And the cruel irony is that the more he tries to please her, the more distant she becomes. The closer he gets, the more she tests his resistance. The more he demonstrates love, the more she explores the depth of that love. In the next chapter, you'll see how these dynamics transform into concentrated emotional power, giving her a silent control that the man rarely perceives until he's already completely molded. Male vulnerability is one of the most underestimated and also one of the most exploited strengths. When a good man begins to open up, he believes he is strengthening the connection. And he is. But he is also, without realizing it, handing over a complete emotional map, where it hurts, what he fears, what moves him, what disarms him. And in the right hands, that map becomes power. It all starts with something seemingly harmless. She asks about his past, his insecurities, his flaws, his fears. At first, There is genuine interest. The atmosphere is safe. He feels space to talk. And when he speaks, he feels relief, a rare relief. Good men carry a lot in silence, and when they find someone who listens to them, their minds naturally open. This moment of openness creates true intimacy, but it also creates emotional dependence because he associates that feeling of understanding with her presence. Later, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, this vulnerability begins to be used as a tool. Not cruelly, not explicitly, but in a strategically emotional way. It works like this. When she wants closeness, she uses the sweet side, "I know exactly how you feel." When she wants distance, she uses the cold side, "You're exaggerating, as you always do." When she wants an advantage, she uses sensitive memories. "Remember that fear you have." Well, when she wants him to give in, she subtly triggers old guilts. The same openness that was once welcomed now becomes an argument. The same confession that brought closeness now becomes a trigger for insecurity. The same fragility that created connection now becomes a reason for him to seek even more validation. And the cycle continues. The more vulnerable he shows himself to be, the more emotional ground she gains. The more ground she gains, the more he feels he needs her. The more he needs her, the more power she has. This process is not simple manipulation. It's emotional engineering. It's the conversion of vulnerability into emotional currency. The good man feels he must defend, repair, justify, explain, fix. He tries to be better. He tries to be enough. He tries to be stable where she is unstable. And, without realizing it, he enters the most dangerous logic of the game. If I change a little more, she'll go back to how she was in the beginning. But that beginning doesn't return because the beginning was never the standard, it was the bait. Now what defines the relationship is the balance of power. And the more he tries to balance, the heavier everything becomes on her side. His vulnerability has become an emotional balance in her account, and he's always in debt. In the next chapter, you will understand how this psychological debt transforms into self-sacrifice, making the good man abandon essential parts of himself in exchange for crumbs of peace and approval. Self-sacrifice always begins with something small, a detail, an apparently harmless renunciation. The good man thinks, it costs nothing. It's just a phase. That's how relationships work. But the truth is that every emotional concession he makes has a price, and that price is always paid in identity. The process is slow, almost imperceptible. First, he changes the way he speaks to avoid conflict. Then, he changes his habits to please. Later, he adapts his priorities so as not to bother her. And when he realizes it, he has already ceased to be an authentic version of himself and has become a version molded by her expectations. The most dangerous thing is that he believes he is being mature. He thinks he is being a partner. He thinks he is doing the right thing. But in reality, he is entering a psychological pattern called self-dissolution, when the individual begins to abandon parts of themselves to maintain the bond with another person. And this pattern is not born from love. It is born from fear. Fear of losing. Fear of disappointing. Fear of not being enough. She notices this movement. Some women use this unconsciously, others very strategically. The mechanism works like this. The more he gives, the less she gives. The less she gives, the more he tries. The more he tries, the more she reinforces the idea that he is almost succeeding. This almost is destructive. It's the emotional carrot dangling in front of the horse. It's the intermittent reinforcement that creates addiction, a small reward, followed by long periods of uncertainty. He believes that if he tries a little harder, if he shows himself to be more available, more understanding, more flexible, she will finally recognize his value. But that never happens, because the game isn't about recognition. It's about control. Good men become emotional prey when they enter the cycle of chronic self-sacrifice and don't even realize they're in it. They stop going out with friends. They stop prioritizing their own hobbies. They stop setting boundaries. And little by little, they simplify their own lives to better fit within her emotional universe. But the more he reduces himself, the smaller he becomes in her eyes. Because the paradox is cruel. The man who becomes small to please loses exactly what initially sparked her interest. And then he tries to reduce himself even further, thinking that this will improve things. It's the emotional equivalent of throwing water on a shipwreck. Deep down, he doesn't realize what's happening to him. He's emotionally amputating himself, tearing pieces off himself to try to save something that doesn't want to be saved. And this amputation generates an inevitable consequence: the loss of self-esteem. Men who sacrifice too much fall into a psychological hole where they no longer know who they are without her approval. In the next chapter, you will discover why this loss of identity not only weakens the man, but makes him dependent, and how this dependence becomes the perfect mechanism for her to control everything without ever having to raise her voice. Emotional dependence doesn't arrive like an earthquake. It begins like a breeze, a gentle comfort, the feeling that you have finally found someone who understands you, who sees you, who welcomes you. But slowly this breeze turns into wind, and this wind turns into a storm. The good man, already worn down by silent self-sacrifice, begins to feel something new. He no longer lives for himself. He lives for her answers. Everything becomes calculation. Every gesture, every message, every choice is meticulously measured by the emotional impact it can have on her. He wonders, will she like it? Will this push her away? Am I exaggerating? And when a man reaches this point, he's no longer in a relationship. He's in a psychological state, a state called affective hypervigilance. It's when you monitor every micro-emotional variation of the other person as if you were facing a bomb about to explode. He notices when her voice gets a little colder. He notices when she takes 5 more minutes to respond. He notices when the emoji is different, when the kiss is mechanical, when the gaze doesn't hold. Every detail becomes a threat, and every threat triggers a silent panic. That's how dependence is born, not from love, but from the anxiety of losing the little she still thinks she has. And she, consciously or not, feels this. She feels the power. She feels the control. She feels that he no longer reacts, he adapts. And this is where the psychological game reaches its peak, because she realizes she no longer needs to demand anything. She doesn't need to demand anything. She doesn't need to complain. He corrects himself. He prunes himself. He limits himself. Emotional dependence transforms a man into a willing servant. He is not bound by chains. He is bound by fear. Fear of losing affection. Fear of being replaced. Fear of discovering that all his effort was never enough. It's a cruel paradox. The more she distances herself, the more he tries to get closer. The more she withdraws affection, the more he chases after her. The colder she becomes, the more warmth he tries to give. And so the cycle feeds itself. He thinks he's fighting for the relationship, but he's fighting against himself, against his own emptiness, against his own fear. And the worst part, emotional dependence destroys exactly what makes a man attractive: his ability to be autonomous, stable, and centered. A dependent man becomes a faded reflection of the man he could be. But there's something deeper happening, something that almost no man notices until it's too late. There's a type of language that isn't spoken with words, but with gestures, pauses, silences, and subtle changes in behavior. It's in this language that many good men begin to lose their center without realizing it. They don't fall for direct phrases, nor for blatant manipulations, but for what isn't said, for what is insinuated. And this silent language is so subtle that it seems innocent, until it becomes an emotional pattern capable of destabilizing anyone with a heart willing to love. Good men, by nature, are observant. They notice details, value gestures, and believe that everything has a meaning. And that's precisely why emotional silence, when used strategically, becomes a dangerous trap for them. All it takes is for her to change her tone of voice, take a little longer to respond, lessen the display of affection, or make small expressions of discontent without explaining why, and the good man immediately begins to wonder what he did wrong. He doesn't want to lose harmony. He doesn't want to hurt. He doesn't want to disappoint. And to avoid that, he begins to mold himself, adapt, shrink. That's how he loses emotional micro-territories. First, by trying to please. Then, by trying to compensate. Finally, by constantly trying to prove that he is enough. Every silence of hers becomes an unspoken demand. Every expression of hers becomes a code that he strives to decipher. And when a man begins to live like this, interpreting invisible signals, he is no longer in a balanced relationship, but in a subtle emotional prison. The woman who does this isn't always aware of the impact. Sometimes it's a form of self-protection. Other times, an unconscious form of control. But there's also the woman who masters this language with precision. She knows that silence at the right time is worth more than 1,000 words, that a sudden withdrawal of affection provokes more than a direct confrontation, that a slight emotional cooling makes a good man move mountains to recover what he thinks he's lost. And it's at this exact point that he becomes vulnerable, when he tries to win back something that should never have been taken away as a test. The truth is that good men don't need to prove their worth. They already demonstrate it naturally, through their character, their posture, their loyalty, and everything they offer without asking for anything in return. However, when they enter the dynamic of deserving attention, approval, or affection, they begin to accept less than they truly deserve. The silent language that weakens a good man isn't about what she does, but about how he begins to feel insecure, anxious, insufficient, always indebted. And nothing is more dangerous to the heart of an upright man than believing that he needs to make a constant emotional effort to be worthy of love. That's how he loses strength without noticing, until one day he realizes that he no longer knows who he is when he's near her. In the next chapter, you will see how this dependence leads to total emotional submission, and how this transforms the man into a prisoner within his own story. There's an almost invisible line that separates healthy loyalty from emotional submission. And good men, precisely because they are loyal, committed, and honest, sometimes cross this line without realizing it. They believe that persistence is proof of love, that endurance is proof of maturity, that continuing to try is proof of character. But there is a huge difference between being consistent and self-annihilation. And it is precisely in this difference that many get lost. A good man loves intensely, but he also loves responsibly. He cares, supports, protects. He doesn't turn his back at the first difficulty. He doesn't give up when things get confusing. He doesn't abandon when a crisis appears. However, because he has such a steadfast heart, he runs a silent risk, believing that he always needs to persevere, even when the dynamic has become toxic, exhausting, or unfair. The good man endures because he has strength, and precisely because he has strength, he often doesn't realize when he's enduring more than he should. The woman who notices this characteristic can react in two ways. The emotionally mature woman sees this as a treasure, the rare value of someone who truly commits, who truly thinks about us. But the emotionally immature or manipulative woman sees this as an opportunity, a chance to test how much he can endure, how much he will give in, how much he will sacrifice to stay by her side. And that's how the good man enters a cycle where he begins to accept behaviors that, if they came from anyone else, he would never tolerate. He starts by saying, "It's okay It's just a moment, then moves on to "it will get better." And when he realizes it, he's already living in a relationship where his will is never a priority. He makes too many concessions, is too flexible, gives in too much. He confuses patience with submission, understanding with absolute tolerance, love with a lack of boundaries. And when a man reaches this point, he loses his voice not because he doesn't know what he feels, but because he's afraid of losing someone who, in fact, has already lost him emotionally a long time ago. His loyalty becomes a flawed armor. It seems like protection, but it only leaves him more exposed. Because while he tries to keep the relationship alive, she learns that all it takes is threatening to distance herself. All it takes is creating conflict. All it takes is withdrawing a little affection for him to immediately rush to compensate. The good man becomes predictable, and predictability, in the wrong hands, becomes control. The cruelest thing is that he doesn't realize when he started negotiating with himself. A good man only wakes up from this cycle when he looks inside and asks, "At what point did my love begin to depend on my ability to diminish myself?" And it is at that moment that he understands that loyalty is not about self-annihilation. Loyalty does not require sacrificing identity. Loyalty is not about remaining in a space that drains the soul. The true strength of a good man lies not in enduring everything, but in knowing exactly what he should not accept. His loyalty is a gift, but it only becomes a blessing when offered to those who know how to reciprocate. There comes a silent, almost spiritual moment when the good man awakens. It's not a burst of anger, not a scream, not a sudden snap. It's a profound understanding that is born from within at the exact point where pain and clarity meet. He looks at himself and realizes that he spent too much time believing he needed to prove his worth. Too much time trying to be enough for someone who fed off his devotion but didn't reciprocate with the same intensity. And in that instant, he understands. It's not him who is lacking. It's her who doesn't know how to receive. This moment of awakening is powerful because it redefines everything. The good man realizes that, for a long time, he confused intensity with reciprocity. He thought that loving strongly was enough for the other to love strongly too. He thought that presence generated presence, that care generated care. He believed that if he held on a little longer, the relationship would find balance. But finally he understands, balance doesn't depend on strength, it depends on intention. It depends on two people moving in the same direction and not on one carrying the other. This realization causes him to recover something that had been silently taken from him, a sense of proportion. He recognizes the excesses he tolerated, the limits he relaxed, the versions of himself he sacrificed so as not to lose someone who, in the end, never saw him in his entirety. And by recovering this vision, he returns to occupy the emotional space that has always been the space of someone who loves responsibly, but also loves himself with maturity. He gives himself back the right weight, the right value, the respect he has always deserved. It is at this emotional stage that the woman feels the change. Because the good man, when he awakens, does not confront. He simply reorganizes himself. He does not beg, does not argue, does not demand. He simply makes it clear, through his behavior, that he is no longer willing to be manipulated by emotional games, veiled blackmail, dramatic needs, or punitive silence. He becomes stable, and stability scares those who are used to controlling. The woman who truly has maturity perceives this new version and adjusts. She understands the preciousness of a man who loves with truth. The immature woman, on the other hand, panics because she realizes she has lost the emotional power she had over him. And this difference reveals, in a crystal clear way, who should really be in his life. In the end, a good man doesn't become cold, distant, or arrogant. He becomes whole. And when a good man is whole, he ceases to be emotional prey and becomes a choice. A rare, strong, conscious choice. A choice that only an emotionally prepared woman will be able to keep up with. And it is at this point that the real change begins, when he understands that he never needed to fight to be loved. He only needed to choose where to put his energy and who truly deserved to receive it. If you're a good man and recognize parts of yourself in these words, don't ignore what you felt. Click now and subscribe to the channel and discover how to recover your emotional strength, shield your self-esteem, and become an impossible-to-manipulate man who is valued, desired, and respected. Your transformation begins when you decide to see yourself. Don't leave it for later.